Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's to take some really dense source material, the history, the structures, the strategies, and sort of boil it down into knowledge that's immediately useful and, frankly, unforgettable.
Exactly.
And today, we are taking a comparative look at two of the most powerful, certainly the most infamous criminal enterprises in history.
Yeah, huge ones.
We've got the Italian Mafia,
Yeah.
represented by its three major modern faces,
Hmm.
Cosa Nostra, the 'Ndrangheta, and the Camorra, and we're squaring them directly against the Colombian Medellín Cartel, which was pretty much defined entirely by the meteoric rise and, let's be honest, terrifying reign of Pablo Escobar.
Right. And we're working with some complex sources here. I mean, you're talking about centuries of social evolution in southern Italy versus what? Couple of explosive decades, driven entirely by the market in South America.
A huge contrast.
Massive. And the real value in this deep dive, I think, isn't just recounting the violence, though there's plenty of that. It's understanding the core structural differences between them. We really need to get into how their business models differed, how they kept control, and ultimately why one group, the cartel, basically vanished overnight when Escobar was killed.
Yeah, just imploding.
While the other, the mafia, has shown this almost, well, supernatural resilience. An ability to adapt over, 150 years?
That structural resilience, that's really the central thread we need to pull on today, isn't it? How does an organization built on tradition, on secrecy, manage to stick around for over a century and a half?
Right.
While this massive drug empire, controlling, what was it, 80% of the global cocaine market at its peak?
80%. Incredible number.
How does that just disintegrate in less than 20 years?
Yes.
It's a really fascinating study in maybe criminal governance.
It absolutely is. It's like the difference between, I don't know, building a sprawling cathedral of corruption, brick by careful, calculated brick,
Slow and steady?
versus building a supersonic jet. Designed for maximum speed, maximum impact, right? But with absolutely no thought given to how it's going to land safely.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really have to start with the origins.
Yeah.
That foundational contrast you mentioned, deep roots versus rapid rise. We're literally comparing groups whose history goes back to the 1800s against one that basically defined the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, the difference in origins is, I think, the most critical starting point for anyone trying to understand this. When we talk about the Italian mafia, specifically Cosa Nostra in Sicily, we're not talking about something that just popped up as purely criminal in the way we think about it now.
Right, it wasn't born that way.
No. Our research shows that back in the mid-1800s, especially after Italy unified, the whole idea of the mafia emerged less as a crime syndicate and more as a kind of quasi-legal local power structure.
A self-appointed replacement for a state authority that just wasn't there or wasn't effective. That's a crucial detail people often miss, I think.
Precisely. The sources are pretty clear. In rural Sicily, the central government was either miles away, completely corrupt, or just non-existent for practical purposes.
So people needed something.
They needed order. Landowners, regular folks, they needed someone to settle disputes, maybe provide credit when banks wouldn't touch them, guarantee contracts. The mafia stepped into that gap. They provided state-like services, you could say.
Outsourced governance, basically.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They were the ones who could make sure your harvest was protected, or that a debt got paid.
So their initial power came from filling that societal vacuum. They were selling protection, yeah, but maybe also protection from exploitation by others, offering a form of justice, even if it was rough justice.
And that function, that role, allowed them to get deeply, deeply embedded in the local economy. Their control, initially, wasn't primarily violent. It was economic first.
Okay.
Violence came later, usually when that economic control was challenged. The sources point specifically to them taking over essential industries like olive oil and citrus production and distribution in Sicily.
And that wasn't just like muscling farmers.
Oh no, it was much more sophisticated. Control over shipping routes, influence in labor unions, setting prices. They controlled the whole supply chain, really.
And that early economic control, controlling actual stable assets like land and industries, that must be key to their longevity, right? It gives you a reliable income stream that's way easier to hide behind legitimate businesses than, say, a truck full of cocaine.
Absolutely. It gave them institutional stability, a foundation. And that model, it turned out, was incredibly adaptable. Over the decades, this structure just grew. First, across mainland Italy, you see the rise of the Camorra around Naples, the 'Ndrangheta down in Calabria.
Different flavor, same basic idea.
Similar core principles, yeah, but with regional variations. And then it went global, following Italian migration waves, especially to the US and Canada. And later, yeah, they absolutely got into international drug trafficking when that market exploded. But the bedrock was always that infiltration and control of local institutions.
Okay, so hold that image. Slow, evolutionary, deeply rooted infiltration. Now, let's snap over to the Medellín Cartel. Completely different story. No centuries-long evolution here.
Not at all. The cartel was basically born from one specific massive market opportunity. It just appeared almost overnight in the 1970s. Why? The huge and rapidly growing demand for cocaine in the United States.
Right, the market created the vacuum.
Instantly. And Colombia. Geographically perfect, infrastructure-wise, ready enough. They didn't need decades to find a niche. The demand was the niche.
It sounds less like a traditional criminal organization growing organically and more like, I don't know, an incredibly efficient, ruthless, illegal, multinational corporation seizing a monopoly on a hot new product.
That's a perfect description. Pablo Escobar. He started small time, right? Smuggling stolen cars, contraband, that sort of thing.
But he saw the potential in cocaine, the immense profitability.
Then he scaled up fast, instantly, using, frankly, unprecedented brutality alongside some very sophisticated logistics. The structure he built wasn't about subtlety or long-term infiltration. It was all about speed and dominance.
And the numbers just back that up. Our research suggests, by the mid-'80s, the cartel controlled something like 80% of the global cocaine market.
80%. It's staggering. That's not just market dominance. That's essentially defining the market.
You basically were the market.
Pretty much. And that monopoly dictated everything they did. Their focus wasn't slow, careful economic infiltration. It was move the product, make insane amounts of money, and make sure nobody could stop you. Escobar's ambition, fueled by this sudden, unbelievable wealth, it let him corrupt politics, create this terrifying regime based purely on fear.
It's all summed up in that quote attributed to him, isn't it? The one about preferring a grave in Colombia.
I prefer to be in a grave in Colombia than in a prison cell in the United States. Yeah, that tells you everything about his priorities.
It wasn't about generational wealth or subtle control. It was about absolute sovereign power, right here, right now, maintained at any cost. Even death over capture.
Exactly. Not long-term preservation like the mafia.
So that fundamental difference in philosophy, controlling assets versus controlling a commodity, it must shape how they were actually structured, right? How they operated day to day.
It absolutely does. This takes us right into that structural divide. The cartel was optimized for speed, wealth, and terror. The mafia was optimized for secrecy, control, and survival.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Moving from the history, the why, to the how they actually ran the business. We're comparing the pyramid versus the fluid network, essentially.
Right. The Italian mafia, especially Cosa Nostra, ran on a classic pyramid structure, hierarchical, very corporate in a way. And this rigid structure is a huge part of why they lasted so long, why they were so hard to break.
Let's break down that structure for listeners, because the ranks are incredibly specific, very functional. At the very top, you've got the boss, the capo, sometimes called the godfather. Absolute power, basically.
Right. Then underneath him, the underboss, he's like the COO, handling the day-to-day operations, acting as the buffer, the go-between.
And then you get this really crucial middle layer, the capo regimes, the captains.
Exactly. And these guys aren't just figureheads, they're like division managers. Each capo runs a specific crew, often tied to a territory or a particular racket, maybe extortion in one neighborhood, gambling in another, maybe a specific drug pipeline.
So they have their own crew, their own soldiers.
Right. They report up to the underboss or the boss. And then at the base of the pyramid, you have the soldiers, the made men, the mafiosi. These are the formally inducted members who do the legwork, carry out the orders, handle the enforcement, the violence.
That structure, it sounds like it spreads the risk, doesn't it? If one captain and his crew gets taken down, the whole organization doesn't just collapse.
Precisely. It's designed to insulate the top leadership. Compartmentalization. But the real cement holding that pyramid together for centuries, that wasn't just the hierarchy, it was omerta, the code of silence.
Ah, yes.
And this wasn't just, don't snitch. It was a deeply ingrained, sworn, institutional rejection of the state's authority. You simply did not cooperate with police. You didn't testify against other members. ever. Breaking it was a death sentence.
And that absolute code, it enforced a level of secrecy that let them operate beneath the surface, hide behind those legitimate businesses we talked about. It preserved their wealth, their political influence across generations. Omerta meant that even if the state cracked down hard, the organization could go quiet, ride it out, and rebuild because the structure and the knowledge remained.
Exactly. Now, flip that coin. Look at the Medellín Cartel. The structure, way less formal, much more fluid, dynamic. This was really the dictator model. Everything revolved around one man, Pablo Escobar.
So, okay, he obviously had key people around him. Lieutenants, like his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, the Ochoa brothers.
Yeah.
They handled different parts of the operation, right? Production, transport.
Oh, absolutely. He needed capable people. But there wasn't that rigid, institutionalized hierarchy like the mafia had. No formal ranks, no clearly defined territories, reporting up a chain below Escobar's immediate circle.
So how did it function if it wasn't a formal structure?
It relied much more heavily on personal connections, personal loyalty, and crucially, absolute trust, or maybe more accurately, the absolute enforcement of loyalty through fear. While the logistics of moving that much cocaine required incredibly complex organization.
Yeah, the planes, the subs, the routes, that must have been complex.
Hugely complex logistically. But the governance structure, the command and control, it was simple, vertical, one ultimate ruler. If Escobar gave an order, that was it. Non-negotiable. Final.
So where the mafia valued secrecy through tradition and that Omerta code, the cartel just substituted raw terror and massive bribery.
Pretty much. There was no room for nuance. If you didn't cooperate, if you were seen as a threat, you didn't just face social ostracism or breaking some ancient code. You faced immediate, brutal, often very public death.
No long game there.
Yeah.
Just immediate consequences.
Exactly. It was about immediate control.
Okay, so the cartel was like this hyper-efficient, terrifying machine built for rapid market takeover and insane profits. The mafia was more like a shadow government, built for the long haul, for deep control, generational wealth. That structural difference must show up in the types of crimes they focused on, too.
Absolutely. Let's dig into their business portfolios, so to speak. The mafia has always been diversified, the cartel, almost entirely a one-product company.
Right. The mafia's core model, going back way before drugs were the main thing, was about controlling key local industries, extorting businesses for protection. Using legitimate businesses as cover was fundamental.
And their move into drug trafficking, yeah, it became hugely profitable, especially in the 70s and 80s. Heroin first, then cocaine, often working with South American groups like the cartels initially, funnily enough. But drugs were layered on top of that existing foundation of economic control.
They still had other rackets going.
Oh, yeah. Our sources really emphasize their deep involvement in money laundering, using totally mundane, legitimate businesses, think waste management, construction companies, import-export firms dealing in, tomatoes or olive oil, perfect fronts.
And the political and financial manipulation that went with it, that was profound. They weren't just smuggling, they were manipulating the system itself. The sources mentioned the mafia infiltrating the construction industry, rigging public works contracts, taking kickbacks, even deciding where cities could build new developments. That's deep control.
Deep systemic control. And they used murder, sure, but often strategically. Targeted killings. To eliminate rivals, punish informants, or sometimes to send a terrifying message directly to the state itself. We can't talk about this without mentioning the assassinations of the anti-mafia judges, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, in '92.
Just to remind everyone listening, Falcone was killed by a massive bomb, like half a ton of explosives, detonated under the highway near Palermo, killed him, his wife, 3 police escorts. Unbelievable.
Horrific. And then, just 57 days later, Borsellino was killed by a car bomb right outside his mother's apartment building.
That wasn't just killing rivals. That was the mafia declaring war on the state itself, showing they could strike at its highest levels. But it was still targeted in a way. Specific individuals representing a specific threat.
Now, compare that surgical, albeit brutal approach to the cartel, their focus, almost entirely on cocaine, controlling every single step. From processing coca leaves in jungle labs to smuggling tons of it into the U.S. and Europe, that was the business.
And their violence wasn't strategic in the same calculated way, was it? It felt more indiscriminate. Systematic terrorism, almost. Used both to intimidate everyone and as a negotiating tactic against the whole country.
The scale of the terror is just mind-boggling. While the mafia took out specific judges, the cartel bombed civilian targets. That Avianca Flight 203 bombing in 1989 is the prime example our sources highlight.
Yeah, that was just awful.
They put a bomb on a commercial airliner, killed 110 people. Why? They thought a presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who supported extradition, was going to be on board. He wasn't. They killed 110 innocent people for nothing, just to try and eliminate one political opponent.
That's not organized crime as usual. That's state-level terrorism.
Yeah.
It's designed to just break the will of the government, the people, everyone, through sheer horror.
It turned the cartel into an assassination machine. They killed thousands. Judges, police officers, journalists, politicians who spoke out against them, the sicarios, these young, often poor, completely disposable hitmen. They became a terrifying symbol of the cartel's power and indifference to life.
And the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, the leading presidential candidate in 1989, who was strongly anti-cartel and pro-extradition, gunned down at a public rally. That was a direct assault on Colombian democracy itself.
Absolutely. And underpinning all this violence was that simple, brutal choice they offered anyone in a position of power who might stand in their way. Police, judges, politicians.
Plata o plomo, silver or lead.
Take the bribe, often obscenely large, or take a bullet. It just cut through all the layers of coercion and subtle influence the mafia often used.
That's more direct.
Completely transactional, immediate. Why bother with decades of infiltration if you can just buy loyalty instantly or eliminate the problem instantly? Which actually leads us perfectly into the core differences in their strategies for maintaining power.
Right. Let's zoom out a bit. How did they actually hold on to control?
Yeah.
It seems like the mafia relied on coercion and very selective violence.
The mafia's playbook, especially for Cosa Nostra during its peak, was built on a mix. Corruption, yes. Coercion, definitely. But violence tended to be targeted. Murder, ambushes, bombings, yes, but usually directed at specific threats. Rival mafiosi, informants betraying omerta, or key law enforcement figures pushing too hard.
Their goals seemed to be controlling things from behind the scenes, right? Maintain influence through fear, sure, but avoid total chaos. They needed the system to keep functioning, just inefficiently enough for them to skim off the top, corrupt contracts, exert influence. Constant nationwide chaos would bring down too much heat, maybe full military intervention.
Exactly. And this strategy gets even more nuanced when you look at the other big Italian groups. Take the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, their big strength. They rely almost exclusively on blood ties. Memory chip is based on family, these cursed,
Making them incredibly hard to infiltrate.
virtually impossible. It creates an even stronger internal omerta, maybe, than the Sicilians had. And their strategy adapted. They went global with narcotics, massive money laundering, using that tight family structure to operate internationally with incredible secrecy.
And the Camorra in Naples.
Yeah.
Different again, right? More fragmented.
Yeah, much more decentralized. Lots of competing clans controlling specific turfs, specific neighborhoods in and around Naples. Their violence is often more visible, more street level, fighting over territory for things like counterfeit goods, local drug sales. So the coercion is intense, but very localized. But even with these variations, the core strategy for all the Italian groups revolves around localized control, burrowing in, and organizational integrity for the long haul.
Okay, now contrast all of that calculated, long-term, often localized strategy with the cartel. Their approach, absolute terror as the main tool.
The sources are unanimous on this. The violence wasn't just a tool, it was the primary strategy. Constant, massive. Bombings, indiscriminate killings. It wasn't about taking out a rival family capo, it was about terrorizing the entire society into submission.
But there was another side to Escobar's strategy too, wasn't there? The attempt to build popular support, almost like a twisted form of political maneuvering.
Right, you can't ignore that. His attempts at populism, building soccer fields in poor neighborhoods, funding housing projects, even some local clinics.
The Robin Hood narrative?
Exactly. Which was, of course, largely a PR exercise, a way to buy loyalty and protection in his home base of Medellin. Paint himself as a man of the people fighting a corrupt elite. And it worked to a degree. It helped him get that alternate seat in the Colombian Congress back in 1982.
That shows a fundamentally different ambition, doesn't it? The mafia wanted to influence the system from the shadows, bleed it dry. Escobar, it seems, wanted to become the system, or at least bend it completely to his will, using that unbelievable drug money to directly shape policy. Especially that extradition treaty with the U.S.
That fight against extradition became his obsession. It drove his most extreme acts of violence, his political overreach, starting his own political party, bribing officials and military left and right, the mass terror campaigns. It was all focused on preventing that one thing he feared most, being shipped off to an American prison, losing that absolute control he had in Colombia.
And that very concentration of power, that absolute centralization around him, That turned out to be the cartel's fatal flaw, didn't it?
His greatest strength became his greatest weakness. He built a system that could conquer a global market almost overnight, but it couldn't survive without him, without that single point of command and terror.
Which brings us neatly to the end game. So what does this all mean? How did these huge organizations finally meet their end? Or in the mafia's case, how are they just eroded? The way they collapsed or didn't tells us so much.
Completely different trajectories, reflecting those different philosophies. For the Italian mafia, it wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a long, grinding, gradual erosion, driven mainly by sustained, intense legal pressure, not just a military takedown. Remember, they were global, US, Canada, Europe involved in everything, from drugs to construction, waste management, real estate.
Decades of work chipping away at them.
Exactly. And the pivotal moment, the biggest single blow, was probably the Maxi trial in the mid-1980s.
That was huge.
Monumental. This wasn't just another trial. They built a special high-security bunker courtroom in Palermo just for it. The scale was unprecedented. 475 mafia members indicted. And crucially, it relied heavily on testimony from high-ranking informants, the Pentiti, who finally broke omerta, Tommaso Buscetta being the most famous.
And the result? Hundreds of convictions, life sentences. It shattered that myth of Cosa Nostra's untouchability. It proved the state could fight back if it had the will and, importantly, informants willing to talk.
But then came that catastrophic mistake by the mafia leadership, the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino in '92.
The backlash was immense.
It backfired spectacularly. While maybe intended to terrify the state into backing off, it did the exact opposite. That level of blatant violence against beloved national figures, it galvanized Italy. It galvanized the international community. Any lingering local sympathy the mafia might have had evaporated. It triggered an absolutely unprecedented, sustained crackdown by the Italian state.
So Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian branch, was hit incredibly hard, significantly weakened. But the mafia idea, the template, it survived, didn't it? Especially in the other groups.
Yes, absolutely. The organizational DNA proved incredibly resilient. While Cosa Nostra lost a lot of its old power and political clout, groups like the 'Ndrangheta in particular seem to have learned from the Sicilians' mistakes.
How so?
They became even more secretive, relying on those incredibly tight blood ties to prevent infiltration. They focused heavily on international operations, especially high-level drug trafficking and money laundering, moving beyond purely territorial control. They avoided the kind of high-profile, state-challenging violence that brought down Cosa Nostra. They adapted.
Okay, now, shift again. The cartel. No gradual erosion here.
Yeah.
Their end was fast, brutal, almost instantaneous.
Yeah, the sources are really clear on this. The collapse was incredibly rapid, driven by massive combined pressure from the Colombian government, heavily backed by the U.S., especially the DEA, and this specialized police and military unit, the Search Block, whose sole mission was to get Escobar.
And the key, the single point of failure we talked about.
Removing the leader. Simple as that. The capture and killing of Pablo Escobar in December 1993. That was the end, period. The entire Medellín Cartel disintegrated almost immediately.
Because it was all built around him.
Completely. His authority, his personal network, his control over the violence through the sicarios. When he was gone, the whole thing just fell apart. There was no institutional structure, no code like omerta, no recognized line of succession to hold it together. It was finished.
The market he created, or at least dominated, didn't just disappear with him, right? That vacuum got filled pretty quickly.
Instantly. And that tells you something else. The infrastructure he built, the smuggling routes, the labs, the networks, the perfected techniques for mass corruption that all remained. And the Cali cartel, who had operated sort of in Medellin's shadow, often more businesslike, less flashy, they stepped right in and took over a huge chunk of the cocaine trade almost immediately.
So the demand was resilient, even if Escobar's specific organization wasn't.
Exactly. The commodity, the market, the methods, they outlived the man and his specific cartel.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this for everyone listening. Big picture. The mafia relied on hierarchy, deep political infiltration, long-term planning, all rooted in tradition, and that code, omerta, survival over speed.
Right, whereas the cartel relied on brutal violence, centralized terror, and sheer speed to exploit a booming market, all centered on one charismatic, ruthless leader, profit and power now.
Both made staggering amounts of money, both responsible for horrific violence and corruption. But the way they fell apart, or didn't, totally different. Slow, legal, institutional decay for the mafia versus rapid physical destruction once the single leader was gone for the cartel.
The mafia's focus on controlling assets, infiltrating institutions
Yeah.
that prove to be a multi-generational survival strategy. The cartel's laser focus on just controlling the cocaine commodity, a short-term, incredibly violent jackpot, but ultimately unsustainable once the kingpin fell.
And that difference between the structure that endures and the structure that shatters,
Yeah.
that really gives us the final insight into maybe modern criminal strategy.
This raises an important question. If the cartel proved that this kind of centralized terror could achieve global market dominance almost overnight.
Which it did.
But the mafia showed that it's the organizational integrity, the distributed hierarchy, the deep-rooted secrecy that guarantees longevity. What does that tell us about organized crime today, and maybe tomorrow? Does a group like the 'Ndrangheta, highly decentralized, incredibly wealthy from global drug trade, operating through those impenetrable blood ties, generally avoiding spectacular acts of terror that draw massive state attention, do they represent the ultimate evolution, the most resilient form of criminal enterprise?
It suggests the most dangerous criminal group might not be the loudest one, the one setting off the biggest bombs. It might be the one you barely hear about. Because its structure, its institutional knowledge, its secrecy are all perfectly designed to adapt and endure, maybe for the next 100 years.
Indeed. It really points towards institutional depth, adaptability, and enforced secrecy, not just raw power or market share being the ultimate keys to long-term criminal survival.